Around 5,000 years ago, on the flat, hot plain of southern Iraq, one place broke every record in the human story. Behind a long wall of mud brick lived tens of thousands of people, 30, 50, by some counts as many as 80,000. A village might hold a few hundred souls. This held a whole nation in a single skyline. Nothing like it had ever existed. Its name was Uruk, and it was the world's first city. But here is the strange thing at its heart. In the center of the first city stood not a market, not a palace, but a temple, a vast mud brick mountain raised to a goddess named Inanna, because the only way anyone had ever found to make tens of thousands of strangers live together and obey was to put a god at the center. This is the story of the city, and of the day we agreed to be ruled.
Last time, we saw that inequality was not the automatic gift of farming, that some of the first towns stayed equal for 1,000 years. But then the land filled up, and the door opened. Will Durant saw the city as the crucible of civilization, the place where art, law, and thought are forged. He was right. But the first city was not simply a bigger village. It was a new kind of human life, a life lived, for the first time, entirely among strangers, where you might pass your whole existence surrounded by people whose names you would never learn. And a world of strangers needs something a village never did, someone in charge.
That world was born at Uruk. Between about 4,000 and 3,100 years before Christ, the villages of southern Mesopotamia swelled and fused into something new, and Uruk led the way. At its height, it covered more than 250 hectares, and inside its wall lived a crowd so large that no one could ever again know all their neighbors. The archaeologist Gordon Childe gave this transformation a name, the Urban Revolution, and he saw in it everything we mean by the state: a full-time bureaucracy, a standing military, and a society sorted at last into ranks.
And the engine that drove it sat in the middle of the city, the temple. The great temple of Uruk, the Eanna, the house of heaven, belonged to the goddess Inanna. But it was far more than a place of worship. The temple owned land. It stored the grain, it employed workers, weavers, and scribes. It lent, it collected, and it fed the city in a bad year. Clay tokens and tallies tracked what came in and what went out. The first great bureaucracy, with the temple as both treasury and warehouse. And around the whole city spread a web of canals, and the water in them was life itself, which meant it was also power. Whoever controlled the temple and the water controlled the city. That person had a title, the priest lord. In the earliest cities, power was holy. The first man to stand permanently above everyone else did so not with a sword, but by claiming to speak for a god. In the oldest images from these cities, one figure already stands a head taller than the rest, tending the flocks of the goddess, the first portrait of power.
Why did any of this happen? Why did villages become cities at all? Childe pointed to the farming surplus, to irrigation, and to specialists finally freed from the fields. Others point to the temple pulling everything toward its storerooms, and to the sheer pressure of neighbors at war. Probably it was all of these at once, because as cities multiplied across the plain, they began to collide, over farmland, over the precious water of the canals, over pride. And in a world of war, a new kind of leader rose, not the priest, but the strong man. The Sumerians called him the Lugal, literally the big man, a war leader whose power came not from heaven, but from the spear. This is where the king is born. Archaeologists still debate the order of it. The evidence suggests the priest-lord came first, in an age of temple states, and the warrior king rose later, as violence made raw strength worth more than prayer, though the two never fully separated, and the king always kept one hand on the temple.
What was a king actually for? His duties were concrete: to lead the city in battle, to keep the gods content by building their temples, to maintain the walls and the irrigation canals that kept the city alive, and to enforce justice. These were not idle boasts. A city that could not defend its canals or feed itself through a drought, simply died, and its people knew it. Obedience bought survival. Around the whole of Uruk ran a wall so vast that legend gave its building to a king whose name you may know, Gilgamesh. It is a name we will meet again as the hero of humanity's oldest surviving story. And to run a city this size, to remember who owed how much grain to which temple, who had paid and who had not, mere memory was no longer enough. The city was about to demand the single greatest invention in the human record. But that is next time.
So this is where civilization, in the everyday sense, truly begins. And it is worth being honest about what that beginning was. Uruk gave us the temple, the bureaucracy, the written account, the standing army, the king, and the wall. It solved the impossible problem of the city. How do tens of thousands of strangers live side by side without tearing each other apart? By inventing hierarchy, and by making that hierarchy holy. We like to tell the story of civilization as a story of rising, of freedom, of the human spirit unbound. Uruk tells a quieter, harder truth. Civilization began in part as submission, as ordinary people agreeing, in exchange for the miracle of the city, to bow to a temple and a throne. And if you have ever paid a tax, obeyed an official you never chose, or lived among a million strangers and called it home, you are still living inside the world Uruk built. Durant called the city the Crucible. He was right. But the first thing it forged was not a poem or a law, it was a ruler.
Next time on Civilization OS. A temple that owns half a city and a king who taxes tens of thousands cannot run on memory alone. In the storerooms of Uruk, someone pressed the end of a reed into a tablet of wet clay and made a mark that stood for a measure of grain. It was the most important thing anyone has ever written, the birth of writing, and with it, of history itself. The marks that would let us count, remember, lie, and rule. The city had learned to keep its accounts,